Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Ms. Carlson coming at you once again. And today is part 3 of close reading of Jack London's To Build a Fire. I'm just going to let you know off the bat that this is going to go a little bit longer for this session. Otherwise, we're never going to get through this story, is how I'm feeling. In parts 1 and 2, we got through 4 pages. So I'm going to kind of just, brave my way through a little bit longer today. You can always take a break, and come back to your tutorial video. But I am going to go a little bit longer in this part 3. So if you recall, which I would not have if I hadn't reminded myself, where we left off last time at the end of part 2 was we finished page 67. And so I'm just going to back up a little bit and read that last paragraph of page 67 so that we kind of, can remember where we were in order to get to page 68. So if you did what you were supposed to do for part 2, you listened and watched and read along with the tutorial, and then you took quiz 3.5 if you're one of my students. If you're not one of my students, I'm using a PDF of the story, which I put a link to in my part 2 video. I will do my very best to remember to link the full text of the story for you. I got it at americanenglish.state.gov, and it's a PDF of Jack London's To Build a Fire. It starts on page 64, so I'm guessing it must be in an anthology, oh my Lord, anthology of some sort. So that's why it doesn't say page 1, it says page 64, just in case you were wondering. All right, so I'm going to read this last paragraph of page 67, and then I will go to page 68. Once in a while, the thought repeated itself that it was very cold, and that he had never experienced such cold. And he walked along. As he walked along, he rubbed his face and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this without thinking, frequently changing hands. But with all his rubbing, the instant he stopped, his face and nose became numb. His face would surely be frozen. He knew that, and he was sorry that he had not worn the sort of nose guard Bud wore when it was cold. Such a guard passed across the nose and covered the entire face. But it did not matter much, he decided. Okay. What was a little frost? A bit painful, that was all. It was never serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was most observant. He noticed the changes in the creek, the curves and the bends, and he always noted where he placed his feet. Once, coming around a bend, he moved suddenly to the side like a frightened horse. He curved away from the place where he had been walking and retraced his steps several feet along the trail. He knew the creek was frozen to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that winter. But he knew also that there were streams of water that came out from the hillsides and ran along under the snow and on top of the ice of the creek. He knew that even in the coldest weather, these streams were never frozen. And he also knew their danger. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be 3 inches deep or 3 feet. So 3 inches or 3 feet, you're never certain how deep those streams are. They hid sometimes a skin of ice, half an inch thick, covered them, and in turn was covered by the snow. So you wouldn't even realize that it was running water. Sometimes there was both water and thin ice, and when a man broke through, he could get very wet. That was why he had jumped away so suddenly. He had felt the ice move under his feet. He had also heard the noise of the snow-covered ice skin breaking. I don't know if any of you watching this have ever seen an episode or more of Ice Road Truckers, but that is one of the scariest things about that show is when these huge, heavy semis are going across the ice road. You can hear the ice like making all these super loud noises. It almost sounds like a monster. It's really scary. And imagine, you're driving this big rig and worried that your whole rig is going to fall through the ice. So it's pretty creepy. And to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. All right. And to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. That is something we should take note of. So I am putting a circle around it as part of my annotations. At the very least, it meant delay because he would be forced to stop and build a fire. There's the name of our title, right? To build a fire. Only under its protection could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. And I made a little notation of that somewhere. Only under its protection could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. The pronoun for its is fire. Only under the fire's protection could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. I made note of that. I made a citation here, just kind of a reminder. We put quotes around it because it's coming directly word for word from the story. And then I don't put a period after moccasins. I put a quotation mark, parentheses, the author's last name, comma, page number, parentheses. Then the period goes on the outside of the parentheses. This is really important. I'll probably have a quiz question about this because when we get to the point where I want you to cite evidence, which is one of our Wisconsin state standards for reading literature, I'm going to ask that you do this correctly. So I made two notes here that I took directly from the story because I know eventually I'm going to need direct citations from the text. So I might as well start collecting those now because if you remember or recall in part 1, and I think I even mentioned it in part 2 as well of my video tutorials, I am going to be assigning you a graphic organizer to point out evidence from the story about the man ignoring experienced advice, about his overconfidence in his rationality, about his failure to recognize warning signs, and so forth. So I am starting to collect notes while I read, and it's a really good habit to get into when you're asked to analyze literature. All right, to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least, it meant delay because he would be forced to stop and build a fire. Only under its protection, only under the fire's protection, could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. Now, I don't know about you. I would not want to be baring my feet when it's 70 below zero, not to mention the wind chill, whatever that is. He stood and studied the creek bottom and its banks. He decided that the flowing stream of water came from the right side. He thought a while, rubbing his nose and face. Then he walked to the left. He stepped carefully and tested the ice at each step. Once away from the danger, he continued at his 4-mile pace. I do think it's interesting about this, his rubbing his face with his mitten. Maybe not when the story was written, but I know in modern times, there is caution about rubbing skin that has been like frostbitten, which I don't know if he's frostbitten yet, but if you rub skin that's been frostbitten, it can cause a lot of damage. But again, I don't know if they knew these medical things when this story was written. During the next 2 hours, he came to several similar dangers. Usually the snow above the pools had a sunken appearance. However, once again, he came near to falling through the ice. Once, sensing danger, he made the dog go ahead. Oh, poor doggy. The dog did not want to go. It hesitated until the man pushed it forward. Then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly, it fell through the ice. Yikes, the dog fell through the ice, but climbed out on the other side, which was firm. It had wet its feet and legs. Almost immediately, the water on them turned to ice. The dog made quick efforts to get the ice off its legs. Then it lay down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between the toes. The animal knew enough to do this. So it's acting on instinct. It knows to do this. It doesn't think things through, right? It's not a rational being. It instinctively knows to bite the ice out that forms between its toes. Anybody who has dogs with longer fur that builds up between their pads will have seen this before. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being, which we know to be instinct, animalistic instinct. And I made a note here, just like I said I've been doing. I've been making notes along the way. And so I wrote this ellipsis here, this ... just means that I left out the beginning part of the sentence. Sensing danger, he made the dog go ahead. The dog did not want to go. It hesitated until the man pushed it forward. And I am going to add another part to this because I think it's also important that I make a note of this part. I think this is very poignant. So I am going to show you how I take a quote and do a direct citation from the story. All right, so I put quotation marks. Whoops, where'd it go? Quotation marks. Then it lay down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between the toes. The animal knew enough to do this. And here I'm going to put an ellipsis because I'm going to leave out the permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet, because I really want to get to the crux of this, which is that it is acting on instinct. So I'm going to leave out to permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. Well, actually, I think I am going to add it did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being. No period, quotation marks, parentheses, author name, last name, and page number, parentheses, then the period. And I'm going to put it in a different font than what I've got for my page number there because it's too close to my page number. There we go. All right. So now I've got an in-text citation, eventually it might be an in-text citation, but I got word for word directly from the text. I left out one of the sentences and I left an ellipsis there to indicate that. I'm going to spell ellipsis for you here so that if you have a quiz question on it, you'll know what I'm referring to. And I can't remember. Oh, it does have two L's. Okay. So E-L-L-I-P-S-E-S, ellipses. And I don't know if that's plural. I'm going to see. Ellipsis or ellipsis. Oh, okay, so ellipsis is singular, plural ellipses. So is singular, es plural. So, and an ellipsis, let's just look at the definition right now. Might as well. Punctuation mark that consists of 3 dots that omits parts of your writing. All right. Good. We always have things built into our lessons, don't we? All right. So I took that quote because it's really important that we can see that the author is making serious note of the fact that the dog acts on instincts. It does not think things through rationally. The man does think things through rationally. And so he is juxtaposing those two things or contrasting those two things. But the man knew these things, having learned them from experience. He removed the mitten from his right hand and helped the dog tear out the pieces of ice. He did not bare his fingers more than a minute and was surprised to find that they were numb. It certainly was cold. He seems to repeat, the author seems to repeat that, or the omniscient narrator seems to repeat that quite a bit. It certainly was cold. I feel like we've heard that before in some form or another. He pulled on the mitten quickly and beat the hand across his breast. Not really sure why he did that, but maybe as like maybe it gets him warm. I don't know. At 12 o'clock, the day was at its brightest. Oh, I bet he pulled the mitten on quickly and beat his hand to get blood flow back into the hand. Okay. I think I figured that out. At 12 o'clock, the day was at its brightest. As we know, when the sun is directly overhead is usually noon, right? Although he said there was no sun that day, but it's probably just hidden behind a haze of frost and clouds. Oh, here we go. Here it says it again. Okay, yeah, the sun did not appear in the sky. At 12:30 on the minute, he arrived at the divide of the creek. I do kind of want to like point out what just happened. I was going back in my memory of earlier in the story, I think that was the very first sentence or two where it said the sun did not appear. But the fact that the author repeated it matters. Repetition in literature matters. We need to stand up and take notice when things are being repeated. It certainly was cold, was repeated. The sun did not appear in the sky is repeated. Repetition matters. At 12:30 on the minute, he arrived at the divide of the creek. He was pleased at his rate of speed. If he continued, he would certainly be with the boys by 6 o'clock that evening. If you remember, those were his plans, and that's when he had looked at his map. He had figured if he walked at a certain rate of speed, he would be at the camp by 6 o'clock where there was a warm fire and a meal, right? All right, he unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and pulled forth his lunch. Remember, he had that sandwich, right? The action took no more than a quarter of a minute, yet in that brief moment, the numbness touched his bare fingers. I just remembered last time I did the slideshow. I think I'll do that again. My apologies for not remembering that I had done that before, and it makes the text so much bigger for you to be able to read and follow along here. So my apologies. All right. The action took no more than a quarter of a minute, yet in that brief moment, the numbness touched his bare fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead struck the fingers against his leg. Again, I think that's supposed to like bring blood flow to the fingers. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The pain that followed the striking of his fingers against his leg ceased so quickly that he was frightened. He had not had time to take a bite of his lunch. So you need to really be worried about frostbite at this point if that is how fast the pain goes away from the cold. Because as soon as you don't feel pain from the cold anymore, it's very possible that you've suffered frostbite. He had not had time to take a bite of his lunch. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten. Then he bared the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice around his mouth prevented him. Then he knew what was wrong. He had forgotten. Whoops. See, this is the problem with doing this slideshow is every time I click, it goes to the next page. And I was going to get that little arrow. Oh, well, we'll keep reading. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice around his mouth prevented him. Then he knew what was wrong. He had forgotten to build a fire and warm himself. He laughed at his own foolishness. As he laughed, he noted the numbness of his bare fingers. Also, he noted that the feeling which had first come to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or whether they were numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided that they were numb. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was somewhat frightened. He stamped forcefully until the feeling returned to his feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. There it is again. It certainly was cold. Remember how it keeps saying that? Here it is again. It certainly was cold, was his thought. Remember, he doesn't really think about like deep things. He doesn't really think about the meaning of life, and he doesn't like look back on past relationships and things like that. He's not that kind of a thinker. He thinks in facts, right? It's cold, like duh, yeah. Thank you, Captain Obvious, but yeah, those are his thoughts. What is in right directly happening to him right now is where he thinks. He doesn't think about, any abstract thoughts. All right. Um, It certainly was cold, was his thought. That man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in this country, and he had laughed at him at the time. Okay, that was one of our graphic organizer entries, is going to be something about how he ignores the advice of others. So we don't know what this guy's name is, but we're going to call him the man from Sulphur Creek. And he comes up repeatedly as well in this story. So that man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in this country. And he had laughed at him at the time. Tisk tisk. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. There it is again. I could circle that again. It was cold. It'd be fun to kind of go back and see how many times that comes up when we get done with the story. He walked a few steps, stamping his feet and waving his arms until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he took some matches and proceeded to make a fire. In the bushes, the high water had left a supply of sticks. From here, he got wood for his fire. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire. Oh, I bet that feels so good at that point, right? Bending over the fire, he first melted the ice from his face. With the protection of the fire's warmth, he ate his lunch. For the moment, the cold had been forced away. The dog took comfort in the fire, lying at full length, close enough for warmth and far enough away to escape being burned. Again, acting on instinct, it just knows like how close it can get, right? When the man had finished eating, he filled his pipe with tobacco and had a comfortable time with a smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled his cap firmly about his ears, and started along the creek trail toward the left. I bet the dog was bummed out. Like, can't we just stay here by the fire? The dog was, okay, here we go again. Here's me anticipating. And that's what good readers do, right? Good readers anticipate what's going to happen next. The dog was sorry to leave and looked toward the fire. This man did not know cold. Possibly none of his ancestors had known cold, real cold. But the dog knew, and all of its family knew. So there's that years and years and years of instinct in a dog from that country or that area of the world, right? And it knew that it was not good to walk outside in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie in a hole in the snow and wait for this awful cold to stop. So, most animals know that during a certain time of year, you don't venture out, right? A lot of animals, I'm not saying dogs do, but a lot of animals hibernate, right? They know instinctually this is not the time to be out wandering around. So they save up energy. A lot of them make like a cache of food, and they wait out the bitter, bitter, bitter cold, right? This is an interesting phrase or sentence. There was no real bond between the dog and the man. Now that's interesting because those of us who have dogs as pets in our home, we have a bond with our dog. This dog and this man do not have a bond. And that's kind of important to know for the story. And you'll see why in just a little while. The one was the slave of the other. The dog made no effort to indicate its fears to the man. There's no trust built, there's no bond between these two. It was not concerned with the well being of the man. It was for its own sake that it looked toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of the whip in his voice. So this dog is familiar with men's commands. And we don't know, did he rent this dog? Did he buy this dog just for this trip? I guess we don't really know. So the dog started walking close to the man's heels and followed him along the trail. And it's very possible that instinctually the dog knows that if it wants fire or requires fire, that the dog can't build a fire. So he relies on humans to light fires. And that's possibly an instinct within the dog as well. The man put more tobacco in his mouth and started a new growth of yellow ice on his face. Again, his moist breath quickly powdered the hair on his face with white. He looked around him. There did not seem to be so many pools of water under the snow on the left side of Henderson Creek, and for half an hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, the man broke through. It was not deep. He was wet to his knees before he got out of the water to the firm snow. This is an interesting turn of events. It's really important that we remember that just a few short paragraphs ago, he was using his rationality to figure out where these dangerous pools of water might be, right? Where the creek was not frozen completely through, or where these streams would run through. And then here we have, there did not seem to be so many pools of water on the snow on the left side of Henderson Creek. And for half an hour, the man saw no signs of any. So he's relying on his rationale, right? Because he only deals in facts. He thinks he's figured out a way to avoid these pools of water or these streams of water. And for half an hour, it was working for him. But what's dangerous about relying on rationality, especially when you've never had experience in this extreme cold and he's never been to this part of the country, it doesn't always pay off. So here we go. Then it happened at a place where there were no signs. So he's not relying on instinct. He's relying on these rational signs of these streams of water. And then there were no signs, and he broke through anyway. And even though it wasn't deep, he's now wet. His feet up to the knees, his legs and feet are wet. As if the cold isn't dangerous enough, 70 degrees below zero and wet is a very dangerous place to be. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. Interesting how he considered that luck. He hadn't been relying on luck before. He'd been relying on his rationale. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him in an hour. So he only thinks this is going to delay him an hour. So again, he doesn't seem to be that concerned with life or death. He seems to be only concerned that it's going to delay him a bit. And that sends up red flags and alarm bells for me as the reader. Like, wow, that's all you're worried about is being delayed an hour? You're not worried about what it's going to do to your body? Now he would have to build a fire and dry his moccasins and socks. This was most important at that low temperature. He knew that much. Now, I've been camping a lot of times in my life, never in this kind of cold, but I've been camping and it takes longer than an hour to dry wet socks and shoes. So I don't know. This seems a little weird to me that he thinks it's only going to take an hour. But so he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. On top, under several small pine trees, he found some firewood which had been carried there by the high water of last year. There were some sticks, but also larger branches and some dry grasses. Well, that's going to come in handy, right? Because you can only burn sticks for so long, but like some larger branches is going to last a while. He threw several large branches on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from dying into the wet snow. So it also kind of elevates the fire above the wet snow. He made a flame by touching a match to a small piece of tree bark that he took from his pocket. So if you have ever started fires, you know that birch bark makes really good kindling. I just lost my spot. This burned even better than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with pieces of dry grass and with the smallest dry sticks. He worked slowly and carefully, realizing his danger. And that's interesting too. So he does realize his danger, because I don't know if he has before this. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, He increased the size of the sticks with which he fed it being the fire. He sat in the snow, pulling the sticks from the bushes under the trees and feeding them directly to the flame. If I just kind of want to point out, I'm a geeky English teacher here, but this is a kind of an example of personification, the fire almost seeming to take on human form. So you're feeding it, right? I mean, fires don't eat, so that's definitely a personified version of the fire. So he's feeding the fire directly. He knew he must not fail. When it is 75 below zero, I kept saying 70 below. A man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. This is especially true if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile to keep his blood moving. But the blood in wet and freezing feet cannot be kept moving by running when it is 75 degrees below. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze even harder. All this the man knew. The old man on Sulphur Creek had told him about it, and now he was grateful for the advice. Okay, so he laughed at the man. Now he's saying he was grateful for the man's advice about don't get wet. Already all feeling had gone from his feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly become numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pushing the blood to all parts of his body, but the instant he stopped, the action of the heart slowed down. He now received the full force of the cold. The blood of his body drew back from it. The blood was alive like the dog. Well, that's interesting. The blood was alive like the dog. I really like that. And where's my story? I don't know why my story's not showing up here. It is in my thumbnail. Very weird. I'm going to pause for a moment. All right, perhaps this is the universe telling me that we need to stop here for the day. So I will do that. You are going to have a quiz based on this particular tutorial, part 3, close reading, and you will have a quiz, and that will likely be 3.6, quiz 3.6 in the learning management system. I want to give you a clue that you're going to use as a password, and I'm just thinking, what do I want to use? I used that last time. I don't want to use that. All right, I'm going to use this word. It's so weird how in my thumbnail, the story is there, but on the side, it's not. It's very weird. All right, so for your password for the quiz, wait for it. Wait for it. Here it is. That is your password for the quiz. All caps, wet. W-E-T, all caps, wet. Because our Mr. Man got his feet wet and his legs wet. Dun, dun, dun. All right. Good luck. Take that quiz, and we will meet again for part 4. Have a great day.